The trouble really started the day I decided to repave my driveway. The old asphalt was cracking and had more patches than original surface. After years of putting it off, I finally bit the bullet and hired a contractor to tear it out and pour fresh concrete. It was a huge expense, but I figured it would last for decades and improve the look of the property. The job took 3 days and the new driveway looked amazing. Clean, smooth, and a pristine cream color that brightened up the whole front of the house. I was thrilled with how it turned out. My wife even joked that it looked like a runway. It was so flawless. So you can imagine my shock when, not 24 hours after the concrete had cured, I found Mrs. Gladwell standing in the middle of my new driveway, her arms folded and her brows knitted into a single angry caterpillar across her forehead. She was scowling at the concrete like it had personally insulted her. I approached her cautiously, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Gladwell. What can I do for you?" She thrust a finger at my driveway, nearly jabbing it right into the fresh concrete. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Peterson?" Her tone could have curdled milk. I glanced down at the smooth concrete, then back at her, totally baffled. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. The meaning of what exactly?" "This," she practically spat, gesturing up and down the driveway. This unauthorized modification to your property." I couldn't help but laugh, which in retrospect was not the wisest reaction. Unauthorized? Mrs. Gladwell, it's a driveway on my property that I paid for. If looks could kill, I would have been 6 feet under from the death glare Mrs. Gladwell leveled my way. "Nothing is yours outright in this neighborhood, Mr. Peterson," she said acidly. "You agreed to abide by the covenants when you purchased this property, and those covenants clearly state that any alterations to driveways must be pre-approved by the board." I stared at her incredulously. This had to be a joke. "It's the same driveway," I said slowly, as if explaining it to a child. "I didn't alter anything. I just replaced what was already here." Mrs. Gladwell snatched a piece of paper from her clipboard and thrust it under my nose. "Did you or did you not change the material from asphalt to concrete?" I glanced at the paper, which appeared to be a printout of the HOA guidelines. "Well, yes, but—" "And concrete is, in fact, a distinct material from asphalt, is it not?" "Obviously, but I don't see how." "Then you, Mr. Peterson, have made an unauthorized modification to your driveway in direct violation of our bylaws." Mrs. Gladwell practically crowed with triumph. She flipped the paper over and stabbed a finger at a specific line item, her claw-like nail punctuating each word. "All driveways within the Oakwood Estates neighborhood shall be paved with asphalt. Any change in material must be pre-approved by the board. Violations subject to a fine of $200 per square foot." My jaw dropped as the implication stunk in. I thought about the size of my driveway, the cost per square foot. A panicky flutter started up in my chest. Mrs. Gladwell saw the realization dawn on my face, and a smug little smile tugged at her thin lips. "I see you're beginning to understand the gravity of your transgression, Mr. Peterson. By my rough estimation, you're looking at a fine of She pretended to ponder, tapping one ragged nail against her teeth. "Somewhere in the ballpark of $50,000. $50,000. The number hit me like a sock to the gut. That was nearly triple what I had just paid to have the driveway poured. An insane amount of money for an utterly arbitrary rule. "Mrs. Gladwell, please," I heard myself say through numb lips. "Be reasonable. I'm not hurting anyone. I was just trying to improve my property. I'll get approval next time, but fining me $50,000 for a driveway. That's ludicrous." "Oh, you'll get approval next time." Mrs. Gladwell cocked her head, eyes glinting with malice. "What makes you think there will be a next time, Mr. Peterson? Because as of right now, I see this as a willful, unrepentant violation of our community guidelines. The same guidelines you agreed to when you signed on the dotted line." She took a step forward, getting right up into my face. I could smell the coffee and cigarettes on her breath. "Here's what's going to happen. You will pay the $50,000 fine in full, and then, at your own expense, you will rip up this monstrosity of a driveway and replace it with the standard approved asphalt. You have 30 days. If not, we put a lien on your house and force a sale to recoup the fine. And then you can pave your driveway with solid gold for all I care, because you won't live here anymore." With that, Mrs. Gladwell spun on her heel and marched back down my pristine new driveway, her sensible shoes slapping against the concrete like the tick of a doomsday clock counting down my fate. I stood there in shock, my mind reeling as I tried to process the bomb she had just dropped on my life. $50,000 and my dream home, all hanging in the balance over a slab of concrete. A strange sensation took root in my chest, something more than anger or disbelief. It was the first stirrings of genuine terror as I glimpsed the true depth of the hole I had unwittingly stumbled into. In that moment I knew, with sickening certainty, that Mrs. Gladwell and her precious HOA wouldn't be satisfied until they had ripped my life apart driveway by driveway, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but dust and compliance. The only question was how much of me would still be standing by the time they were done. After Mrs. Gladwell dropped the $50,000 bombshell about my driveway and swept off in a cloud of menace and aquanet, I stood there paralyzed, my brain stuttering like an engine that wouldn't catch. This couldn't be happening. A $50,000 fine over a driveway. It had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Surely even the most power-drunk HOA busybody couldn't genuinely expect me to cough up the price of a high-end sports car because I had the audacity to improve my own property. But as the shock subsided, a cold, sinking realization settled into my gut. Mrs. Gladwell wasn't bluffing. She really thought she had the right to dictate every detail of my home, right down to the literal ground I walked on. And now that I had dared to defy her precious rules, she was going to make me pay dearly for my transgression. Well, to hell with that. I wasn't about to roll over and let some petty tyrant bulldoze my life, no matter how many bylaws she tried to throw at me. I marched into my house, pulled out my HOA welcome packet, and started poring over every page, looking for anything I could use to fight back against Gladwell's threats. But the more I read, the more my heart sank. The HOA bylaws were an impenetrable brick of legalese and loopholes, custom crafted to give the board near limitless power to impose fines, place liens, even foreclose on homes over the most trivial of infractions. How had I missed how completely insane these rules were when I signed the deed? The horrible truth was, Gladwell was right. I had agreed to these terms, as ludicrous as they now seemed. As far as the HOA was concerned, I had no ground to stand on, or at least no concrete ground. Still, I had to try. The next day, I showed up at the board meeting, armed with pictures documenting what an eyesore the old driveway had been, quotes showing I had actually increased my property value, a dossier of equivalent neighborhood driveways that hadn't been fined. I poured my heart out to the board, begging them to see reason. It's still a driveway. I insisted, my voice cracking with emotion. I'm not hurting anyone. $50,000 is a completely unreasonable penalty for a cosmetic change that doesn't impact anyone else. I thought I made a pretty compelling case. Mrs. Gladwell remained stoic through my entire heartfelt plea, her arms folded like a disapproving gargoyle. When I finished, breathless and hopeful, she let the silence hang for an agonizing beat. Then, with great gravitas, she shuffled her papers, looked down her nose at me, and spoke a single word that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. Denied. I gaped at her, stunned. What? Just like that? Didn't you hear anything I said? You can't just deny. Oh, but I can, Mr. Peterson. If you had bothered to fully read the bylaws, you'd know that the board has full discretion to assess and enforce fines as we see fit. Your opinion on the reasonableness of our decisions is irrelevant. This is insane. I sputtered. You're being completely unreasonable. It's like you're drunk on your own power, making up ridiculous rules just because you can. Mrs. Gladwell's eyes flashed with barely restrained glee. Careful, Mr. Peterson. Verbal abuse of a board member is a fineable offense. I'd hate to have to add to your tab. I saw red. I wanted to scream, to overturn the cheap particle board table, to shake the smugness right out of her. but I could see in her eager face that she was just waiting for me to snap, to give her an excuse to tighten the screws. So I swallowed my rage, stood up from the rickety folding chair, and forced my voice to evenness. This isn't over. You can't bully me into submission, no matter how many bylaws you hide behind. I will fight this. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse with my head held high, even as my insides churned with a toxic mix of anger, humiliation, and helplessness. As the door slammed behind me, I heard Mrs. Gladwell's mocking voice drifting after me into the night. Best of luck with that, Mr. Peterson. See you in 30 days. With my money. Walking to my car, I was shaking with impotent fury. I couldn't let her get away with this. I wouldn't. But as I drove through the silent streets of Oakwood Estates, each cookie-cutter McMansion seemed to leer at me, whispering, just comply, just comply. I felt like an insignificant cog trapped in a sadistic machine of Mrs. Gladwell's making. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my pristine, smooth, utterly forbidden driveway, I was choking back tears of frustration. How was I going to get out of this Kafkaesque nightmare? What was I willing to risk trying? I stumbled into my dark house, poured a stiff drink to calm my nerves, and opened up my laptop. If Gladwell wanted a fight, she'd get one. I didn't care if I had to take on a second mortgage. I was going to hire the best lawyer suburbia had to offer and bury that old bat, and so much paperwork she'd beg for mercy. It was time to go to war. The next few weeks passed in a blur of stress, paperwork, and increasingly threatening letters from the HOA. Despite my bravado at the board meeting, actually fighting Mrs. Gladwell's reign of terror was proving to be an uphill battle. I had managed to find a lawyer willing to take on my case, but his retainer fee alone had nearly drained my savings. He tried to file an injunction against the HOA to prevent them from enforcing the fine while we contested it, but Mrs. Gladwell's shark of an attorney shot it down with ruthless efficiency. Meanwhile, the 30-day deadline to pay up or rip up my driveway was ticking away like a time bomb. Every day I'd come home half expecting to find a lion nailed to my door or a bulldozer parked on my lawn, revving its engine menacingly. The constant anxiety was taking a toll on every aspect of my life. I was snapping at my wife, zoning out at work, jumping every time the phone rang. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except the sword of Damocles hanging over my head. And then, because apparently my life wasn't stressful enough, the HOA violations started piling up like salt in my wounds. It was like Mrs. Gladwell had declared open season on my property. Suddenly every minor imperfection was grounds for a fine. Grass a quarter-inch too high. That's a $100 penalty. Trash can left out an hour too late. $50 for being an eyesore. And don't even get me started on the time a FedEx package sat on my porch for a whole 8 hours before I could get home to bring it in. You'd think I was running a crack house from the strongly worded warning I got about that one. It was all so petty and transparent, like a child throwing a tantrum. But the fines were adding up fast, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they became an avalanche that would bury me. The worst part was the smug little notes Mrs. Gladwell would include with each violation, written in her spidery, self-satisfied scrawl. Failure to comply with basic standards is not optional. Mr. Peterson, Oakwood Estates strives for a pristine aesthetic, and your continued disregard for our rules will no longer be tolerated. I could just picture her hunched over her desk, cackling to herself as she drafted each missive, savoring my misery like a fine wine. The old bat was enjoying this, actually getting off on exerting her power over me. It made me sick. But what could I do? My hands were tied by my own signature on that damned HOA contract. No matter how hard my lawyer tried to find a loophole, Gladwell had me cornered. Pay the fines, tear up the driveway, or lose my home altogether. There were no other options. Or so I thought. It was my elderly neighbor Earl who first planted the seed of an idea. I ran into him one evening as he was tottering down the sidewalk with his ancient poodle, grumbling under his breath. "You okay there, Earl?" I called out, grateful for any distraction from my own problems. He waved a gnarled hand dismissively. "Damn HOA at it again. Gladwell's threatening to put a lion on my house over some weeds in my flower beds. Claims I'm detracting from the neighborhood aesthetic. Aesthetic my left foot. That woman wouldn't know a weed from a rose if it bit her on the ass. I started to commiserate, but Earl wasn't done. He fixed me with a shrewd, watery eye. You know what her problem is. She's got too much power and not enough to do with it. The HOA board is the only place that dried-up old Biddy can feel important, so she spends all day dreaming up new ways to make the rest of us miserable. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. You want my advice? Don't fight her head on. That's what she wants, to bleed you dry with her rules and lawyers. You gotta think smarter. Find where she's weak, where she's bending those precious bylaws of hers. Bet you dollars to donuts there's dirt there. Nobody gets that high and mighty without cutting a few corners. With that, Earl toddled off, leaving me standing there with the first stirrings of genuine hope I'd felt in weeks. He was right. If I couldn't beat Gladwell at her own game, then I'd just have to change the game altogether. I needed leverage, and I was pretty sure I knew just where to start digging for it. I practically ran back to my house, my mind spinning with possibilities. It was time to stop playing the victim and start playing dirty. Mrs. Gladwell wanted a war. Well, now she'd get one. And this time, I was bringing a secret weapon. Her own skeletons, ready to topple out of the closet and bury her. Earl's words rattled around my brain as I paced my living room, trying to figure out my next move. Dig up dirt on Gladwell. Easier said than done. The woman ran the HOA like a police state. I doubted she'd be sloppy enough to leave any obvious skeletons lying around. But then again, nobody's perfect. Not even power-tripping HOA presidents with sticks up their asses. Gladwell had to have a weakness somewhere, some chink in her armor of self-righteousness. I just needed to find it. I started by combing through every HOA document I could get my hands on, meeting minutes, financial reports, bylaws going back years. It was tedious, eye-straining work, but I forced myself to read every word, looking for any inconsistency, any hint of impropriety. And then, buried in a dense paragraph of legal jargon, I found it. A single sentence that made my heart race with excitement. The Oakwood Estates HOA reserves the right to levy special assessments for unexpected expenses, to be approved by a majority board vote. Special assessments, unexpected expenses, those were some awfully vague terms, the kind of terms that could easily hide a multitude of sins. I cross-referenced the meeting minutes, and sure enough, there had been quite a few special assessments over the years Mrs. Gladwell had been president. Thousands of dollars, approved with minimal explanation, often paid to vendors I didn't recognize. It smelled fishier than a tuna cannery. I needed more proof, but I knew I was onto something. If Gladwell was misappropriating funds, that would be all the leverage I needed to bring her down. But how to get that proof? I found my answer in the most unlikely of places. My 8-year-old daughter's Girl Scout troop. They were learning about local government and had scored a field trip to City Hall to see how things worked, and it just so happened that our little town kept all its public records there, fully accessible to any citizen who asked. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. So I called in sick to work, put on my best concerned citizen face, and spent a day down at City Hall, sweet-talking the ancient clerk into helping me dig through years of paperwork. And jackpot! Tucked away in a musty filing cabinet, I found property tax records for Mrs. Gladwell's own home. Records that showed a suspiciously low assessment value, especially compared to similar properties in the neighborhood. Records that, if my hunch was right, would prove Gladwell was deliberately undervaluing her own home to dodge taxes, even as she was ruthless about enforcing property values for the rest of us. It was all right there in black and white, the smoking gun I needed. I made copies of everything, my hands shaking with adrenaline, barely able to believe my luck. I was so excited, so wrapped up in visions of my coming revenge, that I didn't even process the other documents I'd seen in that filing cabinet. Building permits, zoning variances, inspection records, all with the HOA letterhead, all approved with the same hasty scribble. It wasn't until I was back home, spreading out my ill-gotten evidence across the dining room table, that the full picture started to click into place. This wasn't just about one corrupt HOA president. This was bigger. This was systematic. And I was standing on the edge of a rot that went deeper than I ever could have imagined. As I stared at the damning documents strewn before me, my righteous anger slowly twisted into something colder, more insidious. If knowledge was power, then I had just become the most dangerous man in Oakwood Estates, and Mrs. Gladwell, her time was up. I had her dead to rights. Now I just needed to decide how to use this nuclear option I just uncovered. Part of me wanted to burst into the next HOA meeting, evidence in hand, and slam it down in front of the whole board, demanding Gladwell's head on a pike. But the more strategic part of me knew that would be too easy. Too quick. No, if I wanted to make Gladwell truly suffer, I needed to play this smart. I needed to let her dangle a bit first, let her think she'd won, and then yank the rug out from under her when she least expected it. I needed to beat her at her own game. And now, thanks to these unassuming pieces of paper, I finally had the means to do just that. Mrs. Gladwell had no idea what was about to hit her. The Queen was dead. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't sleep a wink that night, my mind buzzing with schemes and possibilities. By the time the sun peeked through my blinds, I had the basic outline of a plan. It was risky, bolder than anything I'd ever done, but I was too far gone to care. Mrs. Gladwell had pushed me to my limit, and now it was time to push back. Step 1. Play nice. I gritted my teeth and paid the driveway fine, the full $50,000, draining my savings down to fumes. It physically pained me to sign that check, but I reminded myself it was a strategic sacrifice. I needed Gladwell to think she'd won, to let her guard down. I even ripped up my driveway without complaint, choking on dust and humiliation as her goons oversaw the work to make sure I was using the approved asphalt. I plastered a smile on my face and waved at Mrs. Gladwell as she drove by to inspect, looking like the cat that ate the canary. Little did she know, the wheels of her downfall were already in motion. Step 2. Gather allies. Now that I had proof of Gladwell's corruption, I needed to spread the word, carefully and strategically. I started with the neighbors I knew were also chafing under the HOA's thumb. Earl, the single mom down the street, the retired couple on the corner. I showed them the documents, voiced my suspicions, stoked their own simmering resentments. It was like starting a brush fire. Whispers spread. Neighbors told neighbors. Secret meetings were held in living rooms with curtains drawn tight. We were building an army, a coalition of the fed up, united by our determination to take back our neighborhood. Step 3. Go public. This was the riskiest part, the point of no return. But if I wanted to flush out the full extent of the corruption, I needed to create a splash too big to ignore. So I took my evidence to the local news. The story exploded like a bombshell. Corrupt HOA president abuses power, dodges taxes. The headline screamed. Mrs. Gladwell's pinched face glowering from every front page, every evening newscast. The newspaper's tip line lit up with more horror stories, more allegations of misspent funds and draconian abuses. The trickle of truth was turning into a flood, and Mrs. Gladwell was directly in its path. The next HOA meeting was pure pandemonium. Hundreds of angry homeowners crammed into the clubhouse, waving the incriminating news articles, demanding answers. Mrs. Gladwell was ashen and tight-lipped at the head table, knuckles white as she gripped her gavel. Even her staunchest cronies had inched their chairs away, as if trying to distance themselves from the growing stench of scandal. For the first time, I saw something I never expected to see on Mrs. Gladwell's face: fear. She knew the jig was up. Her authority was crumbling to dust before her eyes, and there wasn't a damn thing in the bylaws that could save her now. When it was my turn to speak, you could have heard a pin drop. I walked to the front slowly, holding my head high, savoring every step. The room crackled with anticipation. Without preamble, I launched into my litany of accusations, my voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. I laid out every misdeed, every abuse of power, waving the damning documents for all to see, the special assessments, the tax dodges, the cronyism, all of it. I spoke the names of the victims, told their stories, channeled their pain. The crowd was a Greek chorus of gasps and murmurs, the tide of outrage swelling with every revelation. By the time I finished, the mood had turned ugly. The crowd was on its feet, shouting for Gladwell's head. She just sat there, face blank, body rigid, like a wax figure watching its own funeral. That's when I went in for the kill. I pulled out one last piece of paper with a flourish. Mrs. Gladwell's eyes widened with raw panic as she recognized her own signature at the bottom. "This," I said, my voice booming through the chaos, "is a recall petition. If we can get the signatures of 60% of the homeowners, we can remove the current HOA board effective immediately and elect new leadership. Leadership that acts for this neighborhood, not against it." The roar of approval was deafening. Dozens of hands shot up, demanding to sign. It was a tidal wave of vindication, of pent-up frustrations finally unleashed. In that moment, I felt more powerful than I ever had in my life. I had transformed from victim to conqueror, David slaying Goliath with a sling of truth and collective outrage. It was glorious. But as I stood there, high on victory, I caught Mrs. Gladwell's eye across the room. And in that brief, electric instant, I felt a chill slice through my elation. Because what I saw in her gaze wasn't defeat. It wasn't fear or shame or contrition. It was pure, unfiltered rage. The kind of rage that burns cold, that calculates, that vows retribution. The kind of rage that was just getting started. Mrs. Gladwell might be down, but she sure as hell wasn't out. And something told me this was far from over. The recall petition spread through Oakwood Estates like wildfire. Within days, nearly every homeowner had added their name, eager to be part of the uprising. The winds of change were blowing hard, and Mrs. Gladwell was squarely in the path of the oncoming storm. But if I thought she would go down without a fight, I was sorely mistaken. Gladwell might have been exposed, her authority crumbling, but she still had her teeth sunk deep into the HOA, and she wasn't about to let go. It started with little things, sneaky moves designed to stall and obstruct. Suddenly, the HOA office was misplacing recall signatures. Meetings were being rescheduled or canceled at the last minute. Obscure bylaws were invoked to question the petition's legitimacy. It was all so blatantly corrupt, so petty and underhanded. Classic Gladwell. But this time, the neighborhood was wise to her tricks. For every dirty tactic, there was a chorus of voices pushing back, demanding accountability. We were a united front, a force to be reckoned with, and Mrs. Gladwell's bag of dirty tricks was running empty. Or so I thought. Late one night, there was an urgent pounding at my door. I opened it to find Earl on my porch, pale and agitated, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "You need to see this," he said, thrusting it into my hands. It was a flyer, crude and unsigned, but its message was clear. Concerned about property values. It screamed in bold type. "The recall effort will open our neighborhood to riffraff and undesirables. Don't let them destroy what we've built." It was like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just dirty politics anymore. This was vicious, hateful fear-mongering, and it reeked of Mrs. Gladwell's desperation. I soon discovered the flyers were everywhere, stuffed in mailboxes, plastered on lamp posts. Gladwell was trying to sow fear and division, to turn neighbor against neighbor. It was a sickening new low, even for her. But the worst was yet to come. The next day, I was mowing my lawn when a nondescript sedan rolled to a stop in front of my house. Two burly men in suits got out, ominously cracking their knuckles. They looked like extras from a low-budget mafia movie. I shut off the mower and approached cautiously, my stomach sinking with every step. "Mr. Peterson," thug number one said, not a question. "We're here on behalf of the Oakwood Estates HOA. There seems to be an issue with your property." I blinked at him, uncomprehending. What kind of issue? Thug number two pulled out a sheaf of official-looking papers. "Code violations," he grunted. "Looks like you've got some unapproved modifications to your exterior. A real safety hazard." "Safety hazard?" I sputtered. "What are you talking about? My house is fine." But they were already advancing on my property, scribbling on clipboards, snapping photos of every inch. I trailed behind them, equal parts baffled and outraged, demanding answers they didn't deign to give. When they finally shoved the papers into my hands, my eyes nearly bugged out of my head. It was a laundry list of alleged violations, each more ludicrous than the last. My hedges were too high. My mailbox was too low. My welcome mat was a tripping danger. It was a funhouse mirror of petty grievances, a Kafkaesque nightmare made manifest. At the bottom was a remedy order, coldly stating I had 48 hours to correct all violations or face immediate fines and legal action. The figure they were demanding was so exorbitant, so mind-bogglingly absurd, it almost seemed like a joke. Almost. And beneath that, a single line that made my blood run cold. Asterisk failure to comply may result in the HOA taking emergency measures to bring your property into compliance, up to and including seizure of the premises. Asterisk. They were threatening to take my home. They were actually threatening to kick me out and seize my house over a goddamn welcome mat. I was reeling, my mind spinning with the sheer audacity of it. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was a full-fledged declaration of war. Mrs. Gladwell was like a cornered animal, lashing out with every desperate, vicious trick in the book, and now she was going for the jugular. As I stood there on my defiled lawn, watching the HOA goons drive away, a cold, clear anger crystallized in my gut. If this was how she wanted to play it, so be it. No more nice neighbor. No more playing by her twisted rules. Mrs. Gladwell wanted mutually assured destruction. Well, I had a few nuclear codes of my own to drop. It was time to burn it all down and salt the earth. This ends now. I knew I didn't have much time. The clock was ticking on Gladwell's absurd ultimatum, and I had no doubt she would follow through on her threats. I needed to act fast and hit hard before she could bulldoze my life into rubble. I called an emergency meeting of my ragtag band of rebels. They gathered in my living room, a grin-faced army ready for battle. I laid out Gladwell's latest salvo, my voice trembling with barely contained fury as I described her extortion attempt masquerading as legitimate HOA action. The room erupted in outrage and dismay. This was a whole new level of warfare, a blatant abuse of power that threatened every single one of us. If Gladwell could seize my house over a bogus welcome mat violation, what was to stop her from going after anyone else who dared defy her? But beneath the anger, I could sense an undercurrent of fear. Gladwell was no longer just a neighborhood nuisance. She was an existential threat, and she seemed hell-bent on burning the whole place down rather than cede 1 inch of her crumbling fiefdom. I let the words hang heavy in the air for a moment, let the gravity of the situation really sink in. Then I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "She's left us no choice," I said. "We have to take her out at the knees, once and for all. No half measures. No prisoners." I revealed my plan, the nuclear option I'd been holding in reserve. It was bold, it was risky, and it walked a razor's edge of legality. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Step 1. A media blitz. I had compiled a dossier of Gladwell's greatest hits, every fine, every power play, every abuse she'd inflicted on our neighborhood over the years. I had victims ready to go on record, tearful families telling the story of how the big bad HOA had turned their American dream into a nightmare. Add in the tax dodging, the slush fund shenanigans, and the vicious recall flyers, and it was a public relations atomic bomb waiting to detonate. Step 2. Legal Armageddon. My lawyer had found a loophole in the bylaws, a way to force a full third-party audit of the HOA's books and practices. If even a fraction of what I suspected was true, an audit would uncover a rat's nest of corruption and cronyism that would make Watergate look like a parking ticket. Gladwell and her minions would be tied up in litigation for years, their reign of terror effectively neutralized. Step 3. The nuclear strike. I had dug deep into property records, old zoning maps, obscure clauses buried in decades-old covenants. And I had found the unthinkable, a way to completely dissolve the Oakwood Estates HOA. A single vote from a supermajority of homeowners, and poof, no more dues, no more fines, no more petty tyrants drunk on condo cluster power. It was the ultimate kill shot, a way to wipe the slate clean and start fresh. Build a new neighborhood on the ashes of the old, one where community meant more than conformity, where property values mattered less than human values. It was, in a word, revolutionary. And as I laid out the plan in excruciating detail, I could see the old fear falling away from my compatriots' faces, replaced by a dawning fire of determination. This could work. This could actually work. But it would take every single one of us to pull it off. It would mean knocking on every door, rallying every family, weathering every inevitable counterattack from Gladwell and her flying monkeys. It would be the fight of our lives, with our homes and our futures hanging in the balance. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each person in turn. "I can't do this alone," I said softly. "This only works if we stand together, if we have each other's backs until the bitter end. So I'm asking, are you with me?" One by one, they nodded. One by one, they stood tall, their eyes blazing with shared purpose. One by one, they joined hands, an unbroken circle of solidarity and resolve. We were more than neighbors now. We were brothers and sisters in arms, an army of Davids ready to slay an HOA Goliath. I smiled, slow and grim and full of teeth. "Well then," I said, "let's get to work." Gladwell wanted a war. She had no idea what she just unleashed. We were coming for her crown, and this time there would be no quarter given, no mercy shown. The Queen's reign of terror was about to come to a very abrupt and very permanent end, and God help anyone who stood in our way. The next few weeks were a blur of frenzied activity and nerve-wracking anticipation. We were a neighborhood possessed, singularly focused on executing our master plan with military precision. We divided and conquered, each rebel taking on a critical mission. Some went door to door, armed with petitions and persuasive talking points, rallying support for the HOA dissolution vote. Others worked the phones and email, reaching out to local media to pitch our David versus Goliath story. I led the legal charge, working closely with my attorney to file the audit request and build an ironclad case against Gladwell's reign of terror. We combed through every piece of evidence, every damning document, weaving a tapestry of corruption so thick it would take a machete to hack through. All the while, we braced for Gladwell's inevitable retaliation. We knew she wouldn't go down without a dirty, bloody fight, but to our surprise, the expected counterstrike never came. No more threatening letters, no goons at our doors, no scorched earth flyers. It was as if Mrs. Gladwell had simply vanished, gone to ground in the face of our mounting offensive. Some whispered that maybe she'd finally seen the writing on the wall and cut her losses, that perhaps even her thirst for power had its limits when faced with total annihilation. But I wasn't buying it. I knew Gladwell too well, knew the depths of her vindictiveness and need for control. This wasn't a retreat. This was the calm before the storm. And sure enough, just when we were starting to think maybe, just maybe, we cowed her into submission, Mrs. Gladwell made her final move, and it was a doozy. I was standing in my front yard, overseeing the repaving of my driveway, this time in HOA-approved asphalt, though not for much longer if I had my way, when a police cruiser came screaming around the corner, lights flashing and siren wailing like a banshee. It screeched to a halt in front of my house, and 2 officers leaped out, hands on their holsters. I felt my stomach drop to my shoes. This was it, Gladwell's Hail Mary. She was having me arrested, probably on some trumped-up charge of fraud or extortion or God knows what. I was already mentally preparing for the feel of cold steel around my wrists when the lead officer spoke, and my jaw nearly hit the pavement. "Is this the residence of Dolores Gladwell?" he barked, glancing down at his notepad. I blinked, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry. What?" The officer looked annoyed. "Dolores Gladwell, president of the Homeowners Association. We have a warrant for her arrest, and our records show this is her listed address." For a moment I could only gape like a landed fish, my brain struggling to process this unexpected turn. The other officer piped up, clearly impatient with my befuddlement. "Sir, are you or are you not harboring Dolores Gladwell in this home?" And that's when it hit me. the notice of violations, the 48-hour deadline, the threat of property seizure. In her desperation to destroy me, Mrs. Gladwell had finally overplayed her hand. She had filed those bogus complaints against my property as the HOA president. But in doing so, she had inadvertently listed my address as her own. A slip of the pen, but one that had just come back to bite her in a very big way. I couldn't help it. I started to laugh, right there in front of the bemused cops. I laughed until tears streamed down my face and my sides ached with the cosmic perfection of it all. Mrs. Gladwell, done in by her own hateful pettiness and spite, the ultimate poetic justice. When I finally caught my breath, I smiled at the officers, feeling lighter than I had in months. I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I can assure you that wicked old witch wouldn't be caught dead in this house. I pointed down the street to the beige monstrosity that Gladwell called home. But I have a hunch you might find her over there, along with all the proof you need of her many, many crimes against this neighborhood. The rest, as they say, is history. The last I saw of Mrs. Gladwell, she was being led out of her house in handcuffs, spitting curses and threatening hellfire on all of us as the police hauled her away. With their ringleader toppled, the rest of her crooked cable fell like dominoes, resigning in disgrace or slinking away in the night. The recall passed unanimously. The audit uncovered decades of misdeeds and fiscal malfeasance, and in the end, we got our wish. The HOA was officially dissolved, its stranglehold on Oakwood Estates broken at last. It wasn't a neat ending, by any stretch. There was fallout and blowback, messy loose ends, and lingering scars. Rebuilding our neighborhood's trust, healing the rifts that Gladwell had so gleefully exploited, would be the work of years, maybe generations. But as I stood there on my driveway, watching my family laugh and play on the smooth, unrestricted surface, I knew it was a start. A new beginning, rising from the rubble of the old, a community, not a fiefdom. So that's the story of how I fought back against the HOA from hell and won. It cost me my savings, my sanity, and more than a few sleepless nights. But in the end, I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Because sometimes when your home and your principles are on the line, the only way out is through. And if that means paving a new path, brick by hard-fought brick, well, that's just the price of standing tall. And let me tell you, the view from this side of victory is priceless, even if my driveway is a little worse for wear.